who are joining us today for the panel Publishing Palestine in the Mainstream. We have some really distinguished guests and panelists with us today. They will each introduce themselves in just a moment. But the kind of sentiment of this panel is a set of publishers, agents, and editors. And we want to kind of collectively, and we actually invite you to think about this. We have some aspiring actors, maybe actors as well, to think about what it means to read Palestine. Not just in the US, but in other countries as well. The panelists will talk about the challenges they face getting Palestinian stories to mainstream readers. They will discuss what books we need to get to read and the gatekeepers who determine them. They'll talk about access to literary prizes and translations and how, if at all, any of this might be changing and how. So we welcome you all to this panel. Like I said, I am going to be mindful of everyone's time, so we will end at 4:20, but the intention is to turn it over to our panelists, have a brief roundtable conversation, and then invite you to present them with questions, if that's okay. So first, I'd like our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves, and we'll go from there. We'll start at the end.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep this really brief. I'm an executive editor at Simon & Schuster. I've been a writer and a journalist for many years, and uncovering hidden voices is my passion.
And this is Michele.
Oh, sorry. So I didn't say my name.
I'm Anjali Singh. I'm currently a literary agent at a small boutique agency called Literary. And I'm at this conference because I published Susan's novel, and Michele was Susan's editor, and Asbjørn is Susan's Norwegian publisher. So that's one through line. But before I became an agent, I wore many different hats in publishing. I worked as a foreign scout, scouting American books for foreign publishers, and then I was an editor of vintage books, and then at Ron Mifflin, and then at Simon & Schuster, which is a sister imprint to the company that published where Michele works, and then Other Press, a very small publisher that did a lot of books in translation, and now, as I said, as an agent, I'm in a very mission-driven agency, which is kind of unique in the industry. And part of my journey was getting to a place where I felt like I could kind of be a political actor in the work that I did, which was very difficult to do, but I hadn't really articulated it to myself earlier in my career. So I wanted to cover a little bit of all the places I've been, because I feel like that's one of the things that I can speak to. And I imagine if you're here, you're also just curious about publishing in general. And I feel like part of my mission, having been in so many different kinds of spaces within publishing, is to also kind of unpack the differences in those spaces and also make a very, very opaque industry less opaque. I really see my role in the industry as one of very few people of color in the industry at all, as someone who brings people in. That's just part of what I really care about.
Yes, I'm Asbjørn Øverås from Norway. I've been working all of my life, last 30 years as an editor of foreign literature in Norway, means translated literature into Norwegian.
All right, wonderful. We'll get to know them over the course of our conversation. So we have a set of questions, and I'll engage our panelists. And as we hear from them, please take note of things, because we are hoping to make this more interactive and invite you to ask questions. So I guess the first question is, what makes a good storyteller? What are the kinds of stories folks want to read? Who'd like to start us off?
Me? Okay. I love that question, because while I do care very much about political activism and I have my own private agenda for books, what I really do most is fall in love with stories. And I think that the best storytellers understand their characters more than they understand their cause. So what I mean by that is I get a lot of books, and this is going to be a theme that I'm going to say over and over again. I get a lot of books that talk about people that have protagonists that are refugees or are characters that we don't typically see in literature, in film, or in television, because a lot of things start in literature and then end up on the big screen. But I rarely encounter unforgettable characters within them. And there's one thing that I hope that everybody would take away, is that a story always has a person at its center searching for something intensely personal and very evocative and very at the heart of the whole story. So whether that thing is an ice cream cone or return to their homeland, there should be a very personal and intimate reason that's pushing them through the story, and we should get to know them more and more deeply, their flaws, their weaknesses, their aspirations, their pettiness, and their more soaring, honorable qualities. But they should feel like human beings, and that's what I think makes a great storyteller, someone who utilizes a human being and makes their own personal aspiration the center of the story.
Thank you so much, Michele. Anjali, is there something you'd like to add to that?
No, I think we are not do. I mean, the good story is not necessarily the only thing. I look for things that are completely different. We are a small country with not so many translated books published a year. So it has to be something that is astonishing in a way. It is different from everything else. Yeah, it changes from book to book. I always very surprised when I suddenly stumble over a new book that I love.
So something that keeps you surprised or intrigued?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it goes on. Sometimes you read books after book after book. I don't read all the books. I stop after some time. And you don't find anything. And you think you are sure that you have missed something.
Yes.
Suddenly in 1 week you have 2 new books that are fantastic. So there is no logic in all this publishing.
But I do think that idea of surprise is really important, right? We read so much all the time, and I have to really believe in the characters, and I have to feel constantly surprised by maybe what they do or where the story is going. And in terms of, because I'm an agent, my job is selling a story, right? And so the writer, when you write to me, you're selling me on the story, and then I'm going to have to go sell Michele, and then Michelle's going to have to go sell our sales team, is going to have to sell the booksellers, but it all starts with selling. And selling, I think part of what selling a good story is giving me something that makes me want to go on a journey, right? And often that is an element of surprise and some kind of stake involved, some kind of stakes involved in the story. It's going to keep you turning the pages.
Absolutely.
Well, that's wonderful. And I have a follow-up, I guess. So how do you cultivate or encourage writers, new writers especially that are trying to find their voice, to kind of locate or identify that surprise? Because I imagine that as novice writers, they're afraid or timid. Is this good enough? Is it something like, so how do you know how to identify the surprise that you want to share with the world, and then how do you find the courage to actually present it to the world, perhaps?
I mean, I guess so often I feel like as an agent, I'm sort of mistaken for the person who's going to teach you what you need to do. And I feel like my job is often kind of to translate the market for you. And by the time you get to me, you've kind of gone through a journey, a really long journey often with your book, of writing it and sharing it with people who you really trust, getting yourself to be part of the right community in some way. And that often means going to your local bookstore, events, finding a reading group that you're in partnership with, going to places like Øverås or Kundiman, right? Like other communities that are bringing emerging writers together and helping them find mentorship. And then in those spaces, they're often pretty good at connecting young writers to people like me and to Michele, who can talk a little bit about the industry, but I also don't want our voices to be in your head as you are creating your story. We're kind of the end goal and the commercial piece in a way, but the journey is really about what does the story need to be and how can I tell it in the best way possible. And I can get you over the finish line once you're 90% there, but I'm not a writing coach or a writing teacher, right? I'm someone who's like, I think this book is really, really good. This is how we can sell it.
Yes. Someone told me something incredible the other day that speaks to this exact thing, which is that stories come from the id, they come from the right brain, and criticism comes from the left brain. Mm-hmm. So you got to turn off that left brain when you evoke whatever that story is. And I think that I honestly believe that great stories come from all the weird things that happen in life and the ordinary ones. So I'm a writer as well. I get a lot of inspiration just from the stories of my friends, my family, my life. Because every time I have a conversation, someone surprises me. Or someone looks like they're going to be something and there's something totally different. Mm-hmm. So it's just really collecting my observations about what the weirdest part of my day or my week is. That's what I say with my partner when I get home. She said, what was the most messed up thing and what was the weirdest thing? And that's what she means when she asks me for my highlights, right? And also, what are the thing you take the most pleasure in is great too for description, but I think the most surprising thing, right? Even the most uncomfortably surprising thing. That's the most inspirational part for me as a writer.
I think Asbjørn, would you like to add to elements of surprise?
I sort of meet the authors before they are published, so there's no possibility to discuss what they will do or have to do. Maybe later on for a second or a third book, but you can write about anything. And that's the interesting thing. If you are a good writer, you can talk about the most normal things, the everyday things about your own now. That's surprising too, how difficult it is to say what you should write about, for example. Believe that you write because you need to write. And we have in Norway more and more young men who wants more to be a writer than to write. I think as a writer you should have this need to write, even if nobody wants to publish it. It has to be the most important thing.
Well, yeah, no, and on that note, sorry, I just wanted to follow up with something, is that I always like to think about what drives people to do things. Because people do all kinds of crazy stuff all the time, and surprising things. And I think that that's what's often missing. As an editor, I'm constantly going back to say, why did this character do this thing at this exact moment? But you can really look at it in life. Like if you've ever seen, you know, a woman that you'd never expect, like cut in front of everybody in the line, and you know that it hurt her to do that. Why do you think she did that? You know, those kind of moments are what really, I think, writers should think about more. What's making me make this ridiculous, incomprehensible decision right now?
I mean, or a question I often ask writers.
Yeah.
Since a novel is such a journey, right? I mean, it's usually years of writing it before you even get to the publication stage, and then another several years. And so the question I often have is, what made you want to tell this story? Because you can be really excited about what made you want to spend years of your life in a story, why it's important to you, it helps me understand why it's important. And then explain why it's important, and somehow that answer kind of is the key to kind of figuring out how to sell people on it, right? Or make them want to read it and care about it too.
Right, but I think that answer has to be a personal answer, though.
Yeah.
Because I'm only saying that because I often get the answer because it matters to my people, and that's not the answer. That is not the answer. Yeah, and you can't, because people like me haven't been seen before. That's not the answer either.
Something to take note of.
It's really not, because that's actually a little bit of a creative cop-out. It's not, because you're not telling me, you're not a storyteller, then you're an activist. Two different things.
That's a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can open that up to other folks in just a moment, to our audience. So let's pivot a little bit and kind of think about the international context, given that we are Palestine rights. And the international context means so much in terms of how we present ourselves and our stories to the world. So how does the international context inform the political implications of publishing? We'll start with you, Asbjørn. How does the international context impact, given that you are in Norway and you do work with local marginalized communities in the North as well?
We meet people in so many different situations. We are in festivals, we are all over, and we have scouts, we have agents, we have all these people. But sometimes, I think it was Elias Khoury. I think I was in Vietnam and went up to a small road to buy some soup, and there was an old French paper, and there was a big article about the Gate of the Sun. I didn't know the book at all at the moment. I read it, and I wrote a postcard. I said, oh, and I said, order it. And we published it. It comes from everywhere, and that's exactly. It's always surprising. I mean, the life of the editor, how people surprise.
I mean, maybe in the Palestinian context, or like Øverås was his editor, and her first book was incredibly successful internationally, and in particular in Norway. Norway was one of his best-selling countries. And I think that, just to say that Palestinian literature, I think, has, it maybe encountered different challenges in different countries, but the fact is, because we have this huge platform internationally, actually helped me then later find a home here in the US. Because I had something to build on. And I know in terms of how she got launched as a writer, it was the international community showing up and being excited about her book that really put Anjali on the map. Because it is a tough and very capitalist, but also it's just a tough market here.
The strange thing with her book was that book came from a Norwegian activist who had got it from the United States. It was still the Scar David. So it was the first time that the book happened, the first publication. And we got it and we started to discuss it. And when we decided to publish it, we really loved it. And we thought there was a possibility to sell it. But nobody, and again, surprise, nobody would dream of what we sold in Norway, but we didn't sell a lot. We sold, I think, more than any other country. We are 5.5 million people. We sold 120,000 copies of that book. It's not imaginable. I would have bet
Incredible.
nothing for 20,000. 120 was impossible to imagine when we bought the book.
But what I didn't know is it came from an activist, so I wonder how important the Palestinian international activist community was in kind of helping make that book what it was.
Yes, but Norway, we don't even, that's also another thing when books come in. Mostly, I think we listen to the professionals because and they ask for an answer quite quickly. An activist coming in with a book, you don't have to answer so quickly. So most of the time we don't listen so much. But then we did, and it was very
Michele, would you like to add to the international context and how that impacts the publishing from your views?
I mean, I think that, I guess the international aspect, how does it impact? I don't know. I mean, I am mostly focused in the United States. Like, I have to really look at this marketplace. I think that sometimes there are books that I think that we might be able to sell the rights for internationally, which can help bolster the case for a book. But it's not really something that weighs very heavily when I'm in my decision to take a book on.
Well, the next set of questions really allow us to focus in on the kind of political and ethical values that kind of inspire your decision making. So what does it mean to be a publisher with ethical and political values, and what does it mean to publish with care and conviction in this particular climate? Especially, Michele, as you noted, you are focused here in the United States, and there's a certain set of orientations around the industry. What does that mean to enter those spaces with an ethical and political? You opened up as you were introducing yourself, right? So you are mindful about those things. So how do you negotiate those spaces to ensure that someone like Susie's book, Susie and her book and her work gets elevated here in the United States, and then we'll go across the world?
Yeah, no, it's not easy.
Thank you for doing that work.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that for me, walking into this job, I knew I was going to be a misfit and an outsider, as I've been in every job that I've ever had. But I actually told my, now the CEO of my company at the time, I said, I didn't even want the job, to be honest with you. I told him, I'm not going to be an easy person for you to work with, because I'm incapable of lying or catering to any kind of corporate agenda. And I said, I can publish books that make money, but I can't not question whatever the orthodoxy you're going to present to me is. And I mean, and I don't think that he understood what I meant. He did later, but I don't think he understood what I meant by that, because it sounded sort of abstract. But what it ended up looking like is that when narratives established around books, or that I thought were very unethical and hateful, frankly, I wasn't just going to sort of swallow it and say, this is okay. I was going to help organize the entire company to say something about that publicly. And when people tried to complain about my book being, or rather Susie's book via me being somehow hateful or problematic, I was going to say, by whose standards? Who are we? And what is, because the answer that was given to me when I found things hateful was, well, we publish for the vast marketplace of ideas and everybody's welcome. And I said, okay, so who's everybody and who are we? And who owns the marketplace and who controls the door? So they don't like to name things in publishing. It's very interesting. They like to use euphemisms and sort of half sayings or words, and they expect you to sort of interpret that or understand that. and not question. I just say, what do you mean by that word or that term? And if I don't get an answer, then I'm like, oh, okay, then that's okay then, right? Because they can't actually tell me this is problematic because somebody's offended on the corporate board, right? They can just say, people might not like it. And I'm like, who are those people? And what is the issue? And then like it sort of shrivels and then people resent me, but I'm okay with that.
Right, they didn't name it because in naming it, they expose themselves.
Right.
So the inability or the kind of tiptoeing around the naming is part of the way that they maintain themselves, but you pushing back against that.
Just asking questions,
like, what
yeah.
does that mean? Like, what do you mean by that?
Right, and
Yes.
then of course then using like their, like as long as you make them money, they kind of can't do anything either,
Right.
Like their value
Yeah.
system essentially is we're a capitalist enterprise and we're here to make money. So as long as Michelle's books are making them money, then there isn't, they just have to keep going.
Right.
But I think part of my journey in that industry too was realizing how much wasn't named about like who are we publishing for. Early in my career, I published a book for Persepolis, and I remember one of my colleagues saying to me when I was trying to acquire it, and she had worked for the Book of the Month Club, so my boss was like, well, ask her what she thinks. She's a really across the board reader, and she said, I just don't know who the audience would be, and I was just like, it's so obvious to me in my bones that there would be an audience for that book. And I feel like it was for me a very early lesson in the way that publishing can pass off subjective decisions as subjective, right? And I'm really, really glad I learned that lesson early. I'm also really glad that I had a whole host of other colleagues who like supported me and let me buy that book as a young editor. And then it was very vindicating to be proved right. But that somebody in an earlier panel brought up Sarah Ahmed, who writes about sort of, you know, what institutions are built for, right? And how hard it is to change their use. And I feel like what isn't named in publishing is we were built to cater to a very particular class of reader, and what isn't named is the whiteness. And you know, our ideal reader is a middle-aged white woman in the West. And we're not going to say that, but it's going to inform how we make decisions all the time about what kinds of books people are going to read. And there's an interesting division between the adult publishing world, which I would say is more purely capitalist. And Michele really is a very unique person in this world. Like when she bought Susan's book, I was like, thank God that we have an outsider and an activist who has been empowered in this way, who could like appreciate Susan's incredible talents as a storyteller, but it's still it's a brave book and a powerful book and a book that was going to offend some people. And yeah, exactly, you have to not care. But a lot of people in this industry, it's a very clubby industry. But the kids book world, so when I became an agent, I got to work both in the adult book world, which is the world I've been an editor in, and now I sell books in the kids book space, which actually is a lot hungrier for representation. And I think it's partly because they're so connected to teachers and librarians and kind of can think about publishing in a longer tail and more mission-driven way. And I also think those demographics are a little bit more connected to who's actually reading, right? Like they actually know who's sitting in their spaces and what they look like. They're not all blonde kids from Iowa.
So there's a shift, perhaps, in publishing too, to be mindful of that. Like, how can we be ethically motivated and then to really be inspired? I mean, and is there a shift?
I mean, I think a little bit on the
Because what they say, obviously, if you have any folks in there, there's definitely something is happening.
I mean, I'm very cynical. So I would say the kids book side, it's again, it's capitalist and it's working, we're going to keep doing it. But I think the bigger thing to think about is publishing isn't a monolith, right? We have like our big corporate side and they have a particular way of operating, and then you have your Haymarkets and your Interlinks, and you have publishers with very distinct identities. And I try and always tell writers, think about the space that you fit in, the culture that's going to actually see and value is going to be the culture that can best help you find your leadership, right?
Thank you for that. Asbjørn?
Yeah, maybe Norwegian publishing is maybe different.
Yes.
I work in a big commercial publishing now, publishing house, and I think that if I could say that this book will sell, nobody would try to stop it for political reasons. I mean, they would accept it. I presume they know everything about my political ideas. I mean, I've never had any problem to discuss politics at work, and they also have accepted that I published books that nobody thought would be sung about, because the publishing also, as a big commercial publishing house, needed also to have these literary lines that they used, and they had to have books that they showed to Norwegian authors, and we are the one publishing this and this book. I mean, it's a whole big story and an image of the publishing house. So, I published several Palestinian, quite a few, and also lots of other Arabic authors. And many of them have been so much in Norway. Don't talk about 120,000, but sometimes 1,000. But we are in a situation in Norway also where we have a board of culture who may buy 500 copies of a book, and it is distributed to all the libraries in Norway, which makes it important for me also to publish a book, and I know that now it exists in Norwegian, and it will be possible to read it for many, many years. So the Palestinian question has never been a problem in the publishing, I think. The discussion about anti-Semitism has not been a discussion at work. I've never heard about it.
Wow. I mean, just in putting as an organizer for this, festival, that's clearly a different issue than what we face. And, just bringing Palestine to life in any space, right? And so it's refreshing, but also very telling that obviously Norway has a very different context. It's like the political. It means something different when it,
It's a question of freedom of expression. Right. We had the leader of the house was for many years leader of the Norwegian PEN. He was we were Salman Rushdie's publisher. He was nearly killed outside his house. He engaged himself in freedom of expression, and I think it has been very important ever since.
I mean, something Michele said earlier about the questions that are being asked. It's like freedom of expression, except for when it comes to Palestine. No questions asked except for when it comes to certain kind of Muslim marginalized communities. So then it becomes like asking to name very specifically creates a condition where they're like, oh, then I have to out myself as like a xenophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian person or no racist, and obviously no one's going to do that explicitly. But I do think that freedom of speech and freedom of expression is something that we are very mindful at the forefront. Maybe I invite our guests to kind of reflect on that. So I wanted us to go to another set of questions that have to do with like the writing process itself from the position of publicist, and then we'll open it up. So how do the presentation and framing of the author, for example, matter from the position of the publisher? So how does the author become? How do you frame the author, if you will? Like, what does that even?
Well, how do you position them is what you're asking.
Right?
Yes.
How do you position the author in this industry?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question because that's where the beauty of art comes in, and being an artist and being a storyteller. I think that it depends on the writer how you position them and what kind of story they're telling. But I can talk to you about how I positioned Susan and Susan's book. And, I really fell in love with this story. It's a story of a young woman named Nahar who is trying to open a beauty salon and wants to fall in love and start a family, a lot of things that a lot of young women want to do. And she was born in Kuwait. She is a refugee. It's very illuminating about, a specific moment in history. And I loved all of that, but that's not why I bought the book, actually. And the politics and the activism wasn't it either. What I loved was the love story. There's a love story at the heart of the book, and I loved the voice. It was two things. It was the voice and the love story. And what I also liked is what Susie said to me when I was asking her, why this book or why this story? And she said, I just wanted to show a woman with a loud mouth who uses bad words and who's a feminist and who's unapologetically sexual in this milieu and this specific moment, because I've never seen a character like that. And I love that too. I related to that. I'm not Palestinian and I didn't have an activist agenda with this. I just liked a smart feminist woman's love story. And that's how I positioned her. I compared her to My Sister the Serial Killer. I had a lot of different books that I put that maybe people would have been surprised by. I didn't actually compare her to any other Palestinian writers. But it mattered because I positioned her that way, and because I talked over and over again about how this is a love story at the heart. This could even be upmarket women's fiction. This could even be a book club pick. That's code for it could be palatable to the masses, right? And it made, the words you use matter. Like, it changed the distribution for the book. Of course, we still positioned it as literary in terms of, we went after awards. She was a finalist for the Aspen Awards Literary Prize, something I'm very proud of. She won the Palestine Book Award, very proud of that. But I'm somehow weirdly even more proud of the fact that she got distribution in Target. You know how hard it is to get distributed in Target? It's one of the few novels I've been able to get into that market, and that means that people walking through their aisles while they're buying baby food, and dog toys can see this book. That kind of stuff really mattered to me, and just using that language. But she gave me the ability to do that because she wrote a book that was so rich and so propulsive and so page-turning also.
I mean, part of the framing conversation started with me because when that manuscript landed in my inbox, it was called Memoirs of a Revolutionary Horror. And I'm sure she would still love it to have been published as that title, but it probably wouldn't have been a target at that time, right? So part of our job is honoring the author's vision and at the same time going, but you're going to want readers. We have to work within this particular market, and I know I want to call this title, and I know why this title is true to this book. And if you read the book, you're like, yeah, that title makes sense, but it's not going to make someone pick up and read this book. And it will also throw out the publisher. But I also think that another piece of the positioning was just publishing it in this beautiful way, right? Like, just a really, wasn't published as a scary political, or activist book. It was published, right, as you said, in beautiful colors in this beautiful package, and something that would really draw readers in and feel very human. And there's these abstract shapes that kind of mimic a dancer on the hardcover, and a woman's profile on the paperback. But that's part of the work, right? Which is that you want to be an activist, you want to get the story into the world, but it starts with the story. But then there are these things that wasn't a compromise, but the title probably was definitely a compromise for Susan in terms of but how are you going to get it into the world in the biggest way possible? Because you wanted to have the biggest impact, and that was why you wrote it, to get the most readers.
Yes. As I said, I work in an e-commercial publishing house, and we don't always agree. It means that I publish a lot also for political vision. And I find it important to reach those potential readers who are quite a lot of people. But the marketing department in our publishing house saw it also as a possibility to reach a women book club book and change the cover and change the title. And it made me, I work once a year, I go back to the old bookshop I started with friends to sell books, and I said, I'm allowed to sell the books I want to sell from my table. And that year I had 3 books on a small table where I put up the quotation from Goldilde, I think. You can't judge a book by looking at its cover. And that was important for me because I was in a place where most of the people would look at the cover and say, I wouldn't touch that book. Because they were buying it for its political content, for the feminist ideas she has, every other thing.
It's marketed in a very commercial, women's fiction way. So and the title was
Nar, story on Nar. I'm a little bit ashamed. It's complicated.
It's very complicated.
And the problem is it only gets interesting when they think they can sell a lot. Because for most of the other Arab authors I published, I could decide everything myself. Nobody cares. So it is sometimes difficult when they think they have touched gold in a way.
Right.
And then they suddenly fall between 2 chairs.
You're not reaching the activists, but you're not reaching the women.
Yeah, that's extremely complicated.
When we see commercial success on stories that are pushing the boundaries, what's the response then become? How do they come back to those follow-up conversations once the book is out in the world and does really well? And then what does that look like when they're coming back and say, oh yeah, that was an amazing decision that you made, Michele, or
and they're like, we are amazing.
So what happens in those decision making, or does that change the next book? Or
Yes.
What happens after that?
Well, yeah, the only thing, nobody ever says, oh, you were right, and whatever. People just pretend those conversations never happened. But I think that, but to be very clear, yes, it does change things. It makes a big difference. That's why creating commercially successful books really, really matters. In fact, I unapologetically made that my goal coming in here. I want to make bestsellers. Period, end of story. Like, if I can get award winners, great, but it's not even my central mission. It really isn't. Because I've seen this industry and what changes things. Like, all of a sudden, if you have a book called Mexican Gothic that sells 100,000 copies, everybody wants any book with a Mexican in it, even though that's not why the book sold well at all. Because they're very, like, reduction, they reduce, booksellers can be very reductive. But it doesn't matter, like, whatever package you have, if you have a person of color or a person from a certain community that does really well, it opens thousands of doors for everybody else.
Yeah.
Actually, we have two stories about Norwegian opinion on the Palestinian question. One was a conservative prime minister who, on the conservative party and all this type of politics, everybody was supporting Israel. And then he went to Palestine. And he came back and he has changed completely every idea he had. And he has used the rest of his life to fight for Palestine. And he reached all those that the ordinary solidarity workers in Norway couldn't reach. My mother-in-law would never listen to me until he changed his mind. And then suddenly everything was different because he said it. And the other is Susan's book. When you sell 120,000 books in Norway, there are lots of people who have never bought another book that year. They have just bought that book. And people were phoning and weeping on the phone and saying, I didn't know that it was like that. So certainly you can do something with books. But most of the time I'm extremely happy when I meet a reader who says, this changed something for me. Because that's also important. That every
Of course.
individual that we can reach. That's
Anjali, do you want to comment on that? Or we can go on. So I have a final question, and I ask you all to prepare your questions because we want bestsellers in this room, so that we remember that's the goal. So we're going to come back full circle. Why do the stories, the narratives matter? The human interest, the affective positionalities. But because they enable so much more, it seems like. So why do the stories, the characters, the human interests, the affect, the emotions, why do they matter so much in the storytelling? So,
I think that because it makes people relate to each other as human beings. Because all of those little moments, heartbreak, trying to start a business, whatever, those are relatable things. They humanize and they break down barriers. I truly believe that. I've been in love with books since I was very young. And also, I think being a marginalized person, they help you see what you could have never imagined. And I used to get in trouble all the time for living in an imaginary world, because that was because my real world kind of sucked. And I really wanted a place where people like me could be in jobs and not just married and having kids. And that was all I ever saw, were women that tried to look beautiful so they could catch the right man. That was what the reality that I was raised with. So for me, books were a way that I could live another life. The way that they say that you can't be what you can't see. Well, I couldn't see it. That's the only place. It's still the only place I can see things that I dream of.
No, I think it's complicated in many ways. I published Hassan Qasim, an Iraqi refugee who walked from Iraq to Finland. It's short stories that are kind of surrealistic, that shows a little bit the completely mad life you have after the emergence of Iraq. It's not storytelling in the ordinary way. I would know at once that this will never be a bestseller, but it reaches you and it tells something about what's happening in Iraq in a very different way, which is important.
Thank you, Asbjørn. Anjali?
I'm going to get back into
Thank you so much to our panelists. What we would like to do, we have about 15 minutes left, and I encourage, this is a great space, a communal space. Do we have any questions for our panelists? I do have a microphone, please. Well, perhaps what we could do is take a cue right up here, because we do have one mic, if that's all right. I'm going to invite you to come up here, and then that way I can hold up the mic as you are asking your question. And then we're
Yeah, it's all good.
My name is Anjali. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I have a question, and it really goes to Michelle's point where you started off saying, why do people do things? So I'm a criminal defense attorney. I ended up writing a book, which I had never planned on doing, on a criminal case that was essentially 2 FBI informants coming in, manufacturing a plot, and then later foiling the same plot manufactured. And I was able to recreate the story based on the dialogue that was reported by the informants. So my question really goes down to the commercial aspect of this industry, because I wrote this book to answer that question, not to answer an academic question, but so that people understand what motivates informants. Spoiler alert, they have a gun to their head by the federal government. And then what makes the targets of these informants the targets, for example, like why are they so emotionally malleable or whatever. And so I wrote it like a political thriller using the dialogue, as I've mentioned, meticulously researched. Now, the problem that I keep running into is, oh, well, you know, the true crime people, you don't have the platform for true crime, or you don't have, you know, you're not the right person to have written this book, or we don't have a market for this book. Do you want to write it a completely different way to an academic audience? And the problem is that a lot of academics and activists already know these stories. They already understand kind of the concept, but this goes to the heart of the human being. And then on a macro level shows why we have the surveillance state that we do. So how do we reach out to agents and editors as writers to make ourselves more kind of like commercially palatable, I guess? Or how do we create this market? Or how do we envision or illustrate that this market does exist? You won't know that unless you publish it.
Well, I mean, I think that it's a great question. I think it's really helpful once you finish a book, because remember I said the whole right brain, left brain thing. Before you've written a book, I think that you should just write the book you want to write, frankly. But I think that when you're trying to position yourself, which is what you're talking about positioning yourself to somebody like Anjali, who then is going to position herself to me, right? So I think that when you're trying to do that, you have to really, that's where you have to go to your left brain and get to know what the market looks like. Like, what are the recent, because our whole industry runs on something we call comps, comparative titles, and they only go back 2 years. So a very common thing that writers will do is say, you can compare me to The Great Gatsby or something. And I'm like, well, that's great. It just happened maybe 80 years ago. So it's not really very helpful. You know, I mean, I think that trying to look within what is out there and really working now, and even if you're connecting yourself creatively in indirect ways, is vastly helpful, because we have to do it. Like I mean, I definitely have to do it. You know, she has to do it too. But maybe if she didn't do it and I still fell in love with it, she'd be okay. There's no chance I can walk out. I can put a book forward without doing it. And if I don't find, like, because the comparative titles are a way of pointing out who the readers are. Readers of this thing will like it, and this is why. So, yeah.
I mean, a big part of selling any project, right? Publishing likes to do things that they know already worked, but also are really different. And so it's kind of figuring out how to talk about your work in a way that it just sits alongside these books on this bookshelf. As she said, that's suggesting and framing it for the potential agent or editor as who your potential readership is. It's also helping me know that you've done your homework. And if you've done your homework, it makes me more invested in requesting your book, because I have a sense that you're further along on that journey of understanding how to talk about your own work. Because writing a book is one thing, and figuring out how to talk about it is another thing. And then it does this thing, like this book that's already worked, and then this is what it's doing, different. And I do think that when you started to talk about it, and this is important, I wrote this book because, and this is why it's important, but that actually comes for fiction at the very end. That's like one line. You have to sell me on the story, right? You still start with the story and the characters, and not why this book is important, because that's framing it in a nonfiction way. Is it a nonfiction book? It's a nonfiction book, but written. Okay, so you have to figure out what are the books in the market that have done something similar, even if it's in a completely different space, and it has something to do with surveillance, right? What's a book that can be a touchstone that can help someone know how to think about it, and what book it's like?
Hi, my name
do short story collections. I'm nearing the end of my MFA, and everything I work on short stories, and everything I'm hearing is the novel sells more, or write a novel, or you have an album, you're trying to say something more than a short story. So I do know there is a plethora of short story collections written and published by people of color that have been very successful and best-selling. But I was really curious to know if you had experience publishing those and what was that like for you.
You can take that one, please. Yeah.
Okay. I do think that the perceived wisdom around short stories is starting to change. However, as an agent, you're probably more interested in taking on someone who's written short stories if they do have a novel in them. But it really comes down to how well does the story collection hang together thematically, because you have to be able to describe something quite simply, and it's really helpful if there's just as a book, when you try to sell a book, you want to describe it in 1 or 2 lines, and that's hard to do with a short story collection unless there's just one overarching thing. So story collection gets really all over the place. It's much harder to sell than a story collection that's interconnected or set in a world or exploring, each story is exploring a very specific theme. Does that make sense? And then obviously having certain publications and also the video for a story collection.
No, I always know that in Norway short stories are difficult even if we do it. But I agree with what you say, and that's why when Hassan Nassim was published, it was the whole impression of the situation in Iraq was interesting. And each story the stories were extremely different from, but there was a whole. There was a whole, and I think that's helped a lot.
There was a story to tell about him,
absolutely.
and then a simple line about they're surreal and they're exploring the aftermath. Right?
Absolutely.
And that really helps. So you don't have to know what each individual story is, but you had a way of talking about it as a book or a collection.
Hey, my name's Michele. Anjali, you mentioned before around that you guys kind of take the last 10% of the way, which I'm fully aware of. What I wonder about is, particularly, a question for you and for Michele is, in that 10%, what is when you're, trying to work through with an author their story, some marginalized story, what is the common pieces of feedback you find that you're often telling your writers to do?
Yeah, no, I can definitely answer this. I mean, that's why I started out saying what I said, right? I feel like 2 things I say over and over again are character development. Characters are perennially underdeveloped, even by very successful and accomplished authors, actually. And then also storytelling, specifically creating a story that makes you dying to turn the page. Pacing, propulsion. Where are we going with this? Are you taking me on a journey where I can't, wait to see what happens, where I don't expect to end up where I end up? Because a lot of stories are very predictable, I would say. I would say a good 99% of them are, frankly. I mean, not to be daunting here, but I really, I know, I read sometimes only 3 pages of a manuscript. Because in those 3 pages, I can tell what's going to happen.
Okay, what's the volume of submissions?
Probably 5 to 10 a week, at least for me. And I'm newish. There's other editors that get 40 a week. So they don't have time. They need a voice. Also, the other thing is turn the voice up. I read so many quiets of somebody talking like this, but on the page. Surprised me, you know what I mean? This is not the place to just be acceptable or nice, I'm so bored by nice.
That was actually a really great place to start. My job is to get her attention and get her to read more than 3 pages, right? And so I think so often with first novels, the first 3 pages are the writer writing their way into the story. And so it's pacing for me. Usually every book can be tighter. And so if I decide to take on a book, it's really because it's the potential and I love the pitch and all of that. And then we're going to do rounds of edits, maybe 2 or 3 or more before we go on submission, because you get one shot to get Michelle's attention. And I know what she's what the competition looks like, right? And how much work it is to publish each and every single book. So you want those first 30 pages to grab the editor. It's really important.
But there are lots of exceptions.
Yeah, of course, there's everything.
I read books that started 3 times and without really succeeding before the 3rd time, and after the 61st pages, suddenly opened up, and it's a fantastic novel. So,
Very patient. He's patient.
it certainly should have been published, even if I had been as a publisher reading 30 pages and said no.
But there was a reason you went back, either you knew that writer was interesting or someone you really trusted,
Yeah.
it's like you have to pay attention to this, right? And
Yes,
you kind of
naturally.
need something to get you back.
No.
Maybe I would have published it if I read it as an editor. That's what I mean.
No, that's really helpful because I think, I'm in a fellowship right now with my book fair, and the kind of unofficial takeaway I was given is that I applied for like 20 different fellowships. Most all of them required my first 10, 20, 30 pages, all rejections, and my book fair required 70 pages. So it's like I knew my book got better. I already know that I need to edit the first 10 pages. I'm very clear on that. But no, I just wanted to comment. Thank you.
I always tell people before you kind of get to that conversation with agents, be very, very intentional and only approach a few agents at a time.
Yeah.
But also have everyone you know and your mother and your grandmother and everyone you know read this book and give you feedback. Right? That's the left brain part too, right? Which is you wrote the book you wanted and now you actually have to open your critical faculties and accept that maybe it's going to be better. Because it could always be better, because then I'm going to edit it, and then she's going to edit it.
Yeah. And my best advice in terms of getting feedback is not to listen. It's not what people say. It's whether it's when they beg you for more. Give them a partial and don't say anything. And then see if they come back and say, where's the rest of it? But most of the time they won't. Sorry, it's true.
Hi, I'm Michele. By day I'm an attorney at Palestine Legal, and but I'm also on sub right now with a novel set in Palestine, and I have an amazing agent. I love her, but I'm also a little nervous because even though I like to think it's got great characters and plot and all that, it is sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. So I'm just curious what advice you give for emerging writers as far as holding out for a mainstream publisher versus an indie publisher, especially if you want to write that best-selling novel. Any tips?
Anjali, should I answer?
Well, it's already victory that you're in the hands of someone that you really trust, who you feel like really gets your book. In an ideal world, you'll get to have multiple conversations with different editors who are interested, and then you get to weigh, what does this person say? How are they thinking about my book? What does this house do well? I do often think if you can afford to be the big fish in the small pond, you are going to get more love and attention in a smaller place sometimes, right? But or you just get one shot, right? You have one editor who really believes in it, and that's really all you need. And then actually take your agent's guidance as you get closer to publication, because that's actually where a lot of it does fall to the author, and where bringing in extra resources can really help if it's a small press with not a lot of resources, then maybe you are going to want to bring in a freelance publicist. And if it's a big press and you're not sensing that they're really going to put resources behind your book, then maybe you're going to want to bring in a freelance publicist, right? If you can do that, it's often a really good idea. Because they're going to hit all of the mainstream spaces, like New York Times, all of the national media, that's their job, but they aren't going to market to particular demographics, to professors of Arab American literature, to activists in the ways that you probably have a network that would really, really respond to your work.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Dalul. I am a writer based in Montreal, Canada, and I'm just finishing up editing my first novel. So, emerging fiction writer, hopefully. I wanted to ask a question about, I guess if I can put this eloquently, how can emerging writers face the challenges of feeling muted when we're trying to sell our work? And if we get to that point, by finding an agent and an editor, because I have noticed that, no one here, actually, definitely not Susan, but a lot of Palestinian writers who I have read, especially perhaps Canadian ones, they seem almost apologetic for the plight that we have faced over the past 75 years when they are writing about Palestine, and that's something I really don't want or wish to get pushed into just for the sake of selling the book. So have you experienced that at all? Or?
I mean, I feel like that's probably self-muting, my guess is, because I don't know. I do think that there's more space to be radical now than there used to be. So I don't know actually what generation you're talking, I don't really know how to answer it in an abstract way. All I can say is that you have to kind of trust your gut and find the partners who are like-minded and truly believe in supporting your voice. And there are lots of ways beyond just that book of getting it out there. Like, there's all kinds of other platforms that you can be writing for, too.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think that you have to speak in the loudest voice possible and be honest about your point of view. Because I don't see any value in muting anything, to be honest with you. I really don't. I think that you have to lean fully into the point of view of the character that you want to describe. And then you find the right place to publish you. I mean, I think that they'll self-select, right? Like they won't respond if they're not really feeling sympathetic to that voice, or they feel like it's not for them. But the people that do respond are going to be all in for you. It's really sort of black and white in that sense, I think.
Thank you so much for the
Okay.
questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.